Good afternoon, students. And so today's video is going to be about consistency. We're going to talk about how you have to, when you use your verb tenses, you have to be consistent. If you use different cases like first, second, and third person case, you have to be consistent. So we're going to talk about consistency in writing. So I will be using my Nancy Summers book and my Diana Hacker book, 8th edition. So I'm going to now share my screen and we're going to talk about consistency. So the following sections can help you avoid unnecessary shifts that might distract or confuse your readers. Shifts in point of view, in verb tense, in mood or voice, or from direct to indirect to direct questions or quotations. So eliminate distracting shifts. So make the point of view consistent in person and number. The point of view of a piece of writing is the perspective from which it is written. So a piece of writing could be written from the first person, I or we, second person, you or your, or third person, he, she, it, one, they, or any noun. The I or we point of view, which emphasizes the writer, is a good choice for informal letters and writing based primarily on personal experience. The you point of view, which emphasizes the reader, works well for giving advice or explaining how to do something. The third person point of view, which emphasizes the subject, is appropriate for formal, academic, and professional writing. Writers who have trouble settling on an appropriate point of view sometimes shift confusingly from one to another. The solution is to choose a suitable perspective and stay with it. And so when you write first person case, that's I, my, us, we, our. So we use first person case when it's a first person primary source eyewitness account of something that, from your personal experience. So when you're writing for your family or friends, then we use first person case. Second person case, you or your, is used when you're talking directly to the reader, giving the reader advice, telling the reader how to do something. So that's second person case. And then third person case, he, she, and they, is used when you are writing about somebody, and therefore kind of like as in case studies from research. So we use third person case when we are writing a formal academic paper for our teacher, because when we write to our teacher, we want to use formal English. When we write to our friends and family, we want to use informal English. So we always have to take into account the audience and the purpose when we write. So always be aware of your audience, and depending on who your audience is, that's what determines what perspective you're going to use in your writing. Our class practiced rescuing a victim trapped in a wrecked car. We learned to dismantle the car with the essential tools. And so here you have first person case. You're talking about your personal life, your personal experience. And usually when you write about your personal experience, you're writing to your friends and family, then we use first person case. You were guided on your speed and your skill in freeing the victim. And so then if you want to write third person case, you would say Susan was graded on her speed and her skill in freeing the victim. That would be third person case. So maintain consistent verb tenses. Consistent verb tense clearly establish the time of the actions being described. When a passage begins in one tense and then shifts without warning and for no reason to another tense, readers are distracted and confused. So when you are writing different verb tenses, let's say you start out in past tense, then you need to keep all of the verbs in that sentence in the past tense. If you wrote that sentence present tense, then you got all the verbs in that sentence needs to stay in present tense so that you have consistent verb tense. So there was no way I could fight the current and when. Just as I was losing hope, a stranger jumped off a passing boat and swam toward me. And so here you have past tense, past tense, past tense, past tense, past tense. So here you have consistent verb tense because all of the verbs in the sentence are in past tense. So writers often encounter difficulty with verb tenses when writing about literature because fictional events occur outside the time frames of real life. The past tense and present tense may seem equally appropriate. The literary convention is to describe fictional events consistently in the present tense. So if you're describing what happened in a book and you're writing a literature kind of a paper, then you can put the events of the book into present tense. So the scarlet letter is a punishment sternly placed on Hester's breast by the community, yet it is a fanciful and imaginative product of Hester's own needlework. And so here you have something that's happened in the book, The Scarlet Letter, and therefore if you're going to write about what happened in the book, and since what happened, the events that happened in the book is outside the frames of real life, therefore you can use present tense. Make verbs consistent in mood and voice. Unnecessary shifts in the mood of a verb can be distracting and confusing to readers. There are 3 moods in English: the indicative mood, used for facts, opinions, and questions; the imperative mood, used for orders or advice; and the subjunctive mood, used in certain contexts to express wishes, conditions, contrary to fact. And so I will give you, an indicative tense is just your regular fact, when you state a fact. The counselor advised us to spread out our core requirements over 3 semesters. She also suggested that we pay attention to prerequisites for elective classes. The writer began by reporting the counselor's advice in the indicative mood. So here, the indicative mood simply means when you report a fact. Then when you have she also suggested that we pay attention to prerequisites for elective courses. And so that's the imperative mood, because that means you're giving orders. A verb may be in either the active voice with the subject doing the action, or the passive voice with the subject receiving the action. If a writer shifts without warning from one to the other, readers may be left wondering why. Each student completes a self-assessment, gives it to the teacher, and exchanges a copy with a classmate. And so here you have present tense, present tense, present tense, active voice, active voice, active voice. So you have consistent verb tense and consistent sentence structure, which is known as parallelism. So because the passage began in the active voice and then switched to, so basically if you start in the active voice, then all of the verbs will be in the active voice. If you start your verbs in the passive voice, then all your verbs are going to be in the passive voice. If you start all your verbs in the present tense, all the verbs should be in the present tense. If you start all your verbs past tense, it should all be in the past tense. Basically, you need to be consistent in whatever you do. You can't mix and match, because otherwise, if you use a past tense and a present tense and you mix the different tenses together in one sentence, you will confuse the reader. So being consistent in your writing, in your mood, in your tense, and in your perspective helps the reader be able to know what's going on in your paper. Avoid sudden shifts from indirect to direct questions or quotations. An indirect question reports a question without asking it. We asked whether we could visit Miriam, so that's an indirect question. A direct question asks directly, can we visit Miriam? Sudden shifts from indirect to direct questions are awkward. In addition, sentences containing such shifts are impossible to punctuate because indirect questions must end with a period and direct questions must end with a question mark. I wonder whether Carla knew of the theft, and if so, whether she reported it to the police. So here you have indirect quotation and indirect quotation. So I wonder whether Carla knew of the theft and whether she reported it. Whether and whether. So here you have indirect quotation, indirect quotation. So you have to be consistent. If you start the sentence with an indirect quotation, you have to end the sentence with an indirect quotation in order for you to be consistent. An indirect quotation reports someone else's words without quoting it word for word. Annabelle said that she is a Virgo. That is an indirect quotation. A direct quotation presents the exact words of a speaker or writer set off with quotation marks, such as dialogue. Annabelle said, I am a Virgo. So if I say Annabelle said, I am a Virgo, that's a direct quotation. If I said that Annabelle said that she is a Virgo, that's an indirect quote. And so unannounced shifts from indirect to direct quotations are distracting and confusing, especially when the writer fails to insert the necessary question marks, as in the following example. The patient said she had been experiencing heart palpitations, so that's an indirect quotation, and asked me to run as many tests as possible to identify the problem. And so here, if you start your sentence with an indirect quotation, you have to end your sentence with an indirect quotation, therefore making everything consistent. So this revision reports the patient's words indirectly. In other words, indirect quotation and indirect quotation. The writer also could quote the words directly. The patient said, I have been experiencing heart palpitations. Please run as many tests as possible to identify the problem. So if you use a direct quotation in your first sentence, then you have to use a direct quotation in your second sentence. So basically, you need to stay consistent in order for your paper to make sense. Emphasize key ideas. All right, that's going to be the next video. So if you have any questions on consistency, and consistency in tense, and consistency in perspective. So if you have any questions about how to maintain consistency in your writing, in your verb tenses, in your quotations, or in your perspectives, feel free to email me anytime. And have a great day.